Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com. Today I want to continue the conversation that I'm having about money, and in specific we're going to be talking about some of the ins and outs of gathering information for the planning stage. If you recall, in the first video that I did on the question of money, I set forth a threefold division that basically revolves around the period of time a person's in. So that was before you have Alzheimer's disease, the planning stage. Secondly, during, that is to say, during the period of time when the afflicted person's actually paying bills for care. And then thirdly, the after stage. This is not going to pertain specifically to the person with Alzheimer's, him or herself, but rather it's going to pertain to beneficiaries, heirs, survivors. And it can be a conversation of just disposing of assets and dividing assets up. And in that case, it won't be unlike almost anybody dying, what happens when they die. But it can also be a little bit more difficult than that. My mom, for example, when my dad passed, is now in the position of having to pick up the pieces after a Medicaid spend down and recover her financial situation, which is quite difficult. Those will be the subject of future videos, but in this stage, we have to get the ball rolling somewhere, and so the planning stage is going to be that stage where you yourself are planning for your own possible future care, or where you are helping somebody else to plan for future care. And in this stage, as I explained in the first video, a person may or may not have a diagnosis of cognitive impairment. If you do have that diagnosis, it's going to change the way that you plan, and it's also going to change the tenor of the conversation, probably the urgency you feel. But if you're planning well in advance and there is no diagnosis, you're going to have far more options open to you. But in this video, what I want to talk about is just the information gathering that needs to happen. Now, if you're used to sitting down with a financial planner or a retirement specialist, then this conversation won't be altogether different from conversations that you've had with those people in the past. But if you've never sat down with somebody, then this conversation hopefully will help to get the ball rolling in your mind, help get you thinking about the kinds of documents that you need to prepare, the things that you need to obtain and gather and have on hand when you're going to think through these issues and have these discussions. Now, there's a lot to get into, and I want to jump into it, but before I do that, I have to give the usual caveats and disclaimers. I cannot give you specific advice. If you require personalized evaluations and recommendations, you need to consult licensed professionals in your area. Now, I'm going to divide this video into 5 different parts that correspond to 5 different document types or 5 different pieces of information that you're going to want to gather. And section number 1 is going to have to do with financial assets. Now here, what I have in mind is instruments that you're going to have your money in that are broadly considered to be financial instruments. So for example, do you have your money in banks or credit unions? And if you do, then you're probably going to have at least some basic accounts like checking accounts, savings accounts. So you're going to want to obtain your statements and account balances for those. You're going to want to know those. You may also have instruments such as certificates of deposit or CDs, money market accounts, and we also are aware of the fact that many banks will offer, let's say, more specialized products. So these, for example, might be a 529 plan. Now, a 529 plan is set up as an education fund, but it's not uncommon to see grandparents setting up these funds for their kids or for their grandkids. And that brings up a point. You in your mind might have a particular account set up for, let's say, a grandchild. Let's say you have a 529 account. Well, that account might be set up for that child's benefit, but if you are the owner of the account, then it is countable in your estate. It's countable as an asset that you have, and it may be relevant if it were to come down to, let's say, a Medicaid spend down or some other kind of calculation. And so even if you have accounts that are, in your mind, earmarked for somebody else, you still need to understand that they're going to need to be listed at this stage of planning. Now, besides banks, you might also have your money in brokerages or in investment firms. And here we're going to be thinking about things like stocks and bonds or other kinds of investment funds. The main types here might be mutual funds. There are exchange-traded funds or ETFs. You might have your money invested in more, let's say, exotic types of investment like real estate investment trusts or REITs. You might have your money in cryptocurrency. Now, presumably, you're going to have advice in this sector, and so those are going to be statements you would obtain from your money manager or from the investment firm directly. You also want to consider money that you have with insurance companies. One type of vehicle you might have in your portfolio is going to be an annuity. And in this case, since we're talking about assets, what we're talking about are annuities that have not yet been settled. So it's an annuity that you could, if you wanted to, take money from, that you can invest money into, and there may be surrender charges involved, but you would have some amount of cash that's sitting in the annuity that you could draw down if you needed to. Another obvious category in this case is going to be life insurance policies. Life insurance policies are complicated enough that I may make a separate video just on life insurance policies, because you have different types. You have term insurance, you have whole life, universal life, some are temporary insurance products, some are more permanent, some have cash value and some don't. But what you want to get for purposes of planning are going to be informational statements regarding how much is the death benefit, how much cash value do you have in the policy, if any. You might find with life insurance policies that the usual statements you receive, it could be annually or with some other periodicity, but you might find that those statements are insufficient for planning purposes. You may have to actually request from the company an in-force illustration. An in-force illustration gives you a snapshot of the health of your policy at any given time. Now, a third category that you might be interested in from insurance companies is going to be long-term care contracts. Any long-term care insurance that you carry obviously will be relevant to a discussion of financial planning for your long-term care. The long-term care contracts are, again, complicated enough that I probably will spend at least another video just kind of surveying the landscape. In this video, we just want to observe that if you do already have a long-term care contract, you want to gather information about what is the benefit level, how much coverage do you have, over what period of time, and other important facts. Now, another set of accounts that you're not going to want to neglect are going to be your retirement accounts. Now, these could be accounts that are employer-sponsored, so they're set up by your job, basically. They are also called defined contribution plans, and the granddaddy of these, the most common one, is going to be the 401k. But if you work for a school or a nonprofit institution, you might have a 403b. If you work in the government sector, you might have a 457b, and periodically you will encounter people who have a little bit rarer ones. For example, there is a 401a, there's a 457f, and so on. You would want to consult your plan administrator or your human resource department for more specific information. And what you're looking for here is going to be things like the account balance, the tax qualifications, if any. You also don't want to forget about those accounts that you've set up privately, so your individual retirement accounts, and these could be like your traditional IRA, Roth IRA, and so on. Finally, with respect to financial assets, you may also have other accounts, for instance, a health savings account or an HSA, which might be relevant if you haven't used it for healthcare expenses at the age of 65. Then some of those funds become available and you can use them for any purpose whatsoever. The final thing that I'll point out in financial assets are going to be those things that you might have inherited. So if you have inherited IRAs, if you have property you've gotten from some deceased relative, or if you think that that might be something that you would look forward to in the future, you might want to consider that as well in the planning stage. Now, a second overarching category are going to be those assets that are property. So let's just call it stuff and things. Here, the primary one is going to be your home. What is the market value of your home, and are you going by just a guesstimate of the market value, or just consulting Zillow, or are you actually going by an appraised value that is recent? And do you have other property that's significant enough to list? So a second home, for example. Do you have an art collection? Do you own a boat or have other collectibles? Do you have jewelry that's significant? Do you have precious metals? Do you have rental property, or do you own a recreational vehicle or RV? Now, the third segment that you're going to want to consider is income. Now, depending on when you're planning and depending on what life station you're in, the numbers here are going to vary and the sources of the income are going to vary. So, for instance, if you're planning well in advance, then your income stream might well be from regular earned income, just from a job. But if you are in retirement or nearing retirement, then the income stream might be unearned. You might start to segue into things like your Social Security benefit. Obviously, for Social Security benefit, you're going to want to know what your actual benefit is if you're receiving checks now, or what your anticipated benefit is likely to be. The Social Security Administration used to send out mailers. Presently, you can check your anticipated amounts by going onto their website, which is ssa.gov, ssa.gov. Now, many financial planners will tell you that you should verify the estimate. There is a publicly available formula, and if you provide your income history to a financial planner who is knowledgeable about how to use the formula, then that person can kind of get a better idea of whether or not the Social Security Administration's estimates are correct. Some important ages to consider with Social Security. Number one, the age of 62, which is the first age at which you can apply for and receive benefits, but they will be discounted. The second important age is going to be the age at which you hit your full retirement benefit. That's also referred to as the primary insurance amount from Social Security, and it's going to be somewhere between the age of 65 and 67. For most people, it's going to be around 66 and some change. And then the age of 70 is also important. That's the age at which you can qualify for your maximum Social Security benefit under current law. Now, other sources of income that might be relevant, number one would be if you are a veteran. If you had been a service person in one or more branches of the armed forces, then you're going to want to consider your veterans benefits at this stage. Your employer benefits. Now here, we already talked about the 401k and other defined contribution plans, but you might also have, if you are lucky enough, to have some kind of a defined benefit plan. Here we're talking about an employer's pension program, possibly some profit sharing, or an executive bonus plan. There can be other things that might be relevant, and you don't want to forget those. Anything that you might have with respect to a privately generated income stream. So here, if you do have retirement accounts, IRAs, 401ks, and you anticipate being able to draw income from those in the future, you're going to want to have those estimates. Number two, you're going to want to have any estimates regarding settlement of annuities. So if you have an annuity and you plan on settling it to create an income stream for yourself, which is the whole point of an annuity, then you want to have those options available and know what those estimates are. You may also want to factor in any dividends at this stage. Dividends might be from stock companies, they might be from your life insurance policies, but they would possibly be worth some income to you. And then other sources like, for example, do you have rental properties? Do you have intellectual properties like royalties that you receive? And finally, any other source of income that you actually have available to you. Now, some people might work side jobs, and that could be listed here. But obviously, since we're planning for a future possible stage at which you have Alzheimer's disease or some other kind of cognitive impairment, you're going to want to ask yourself, if you have a side job or you have regular income, how long do you anticipate those income streams holding out in the event that you were incapacitated and were unable to perform the work? Now, a fourth category. So we dealt with financial assets, we dealt with property, we've dealt now with some income stream information. The fourth category that you're going to want to consider is going to be legal instruments. Now, legal instruments might have a financial edge to them, they might have a medical edge to them, or they might have both. So for instance, we're talking here about various trusts. Do you have a living trust set up with you by yourself? Do you have a living trust set up with your spouse? There are other kinds of trusts. There's a Medicaid trust, special needs trust that might be set up for special needs sons or daughters. You want to have that information available. If you have any payment on death notifications or transfer on death orders, these might be common in bank accounts or something like that. If you were to die, what happens to the account value? Oh, it's supposed to be transferred to so-and-so. You want to have that information available as well. If you have any titles to vehicles, deeds to your house, make sure that those are available. If you have a will, obviously you want to bring that along. Power of attorney designations are also going to be relevant. You might have one person who's designated financial power of attorney and another person who's got medical powers. Could be one and the same person, but if you have somebody acting as power of attorney or who would be acting in the event that you are incapacitated, you want to know that and have that information handy as well. And then finally, there would be things like your advanced health directives, sometimes called your living will, and these would be things that would include do not resuscitate or DNR instructions and other kinds of things that would be relevant to your future care in the event that you were unable to make those decisions. Now, the fifth and final category, and I know we've gone through a lot, is going to be debts and obligations. So we've talked about assets, we've talked about sources of income, we've talked about kind of the legal structure that you have set up for your family, but in this case, we're going to be talking about your debt obligations. So having assets and income is one thing, but we only have half the picture if we don't know where that money is already earmarked to go. So remember, the whole conversation that we're trying to have here is going to be driving toward the question of how you can plan for an additional large expense, like paying for nursing home costs or paying for home care in the event that you have a severe cognitive impairment. But we can't begin to get a grasp of those numbers if we don't know what your income and expense ratios are presently. So the fifth and final category, as I said, is debts and other obligations. Now, the first thing here is often referred to as MUG, the MUG expenses, M-U-G, where M stands for your mortgage payment, which is for many people the primary expense that they have. So do you have an open home mortgage? And if you do, how much are you paying? What is your interest rate? And then you're going to want to have conversations about possibly refinancing, especially right now while interest rates are very low. But the other thing is, do you have a home equity line of credit or a home equity loan? Do you have a reverse mortgage? For many people, as they age, they hopefully will be paying down their mortgage, and so you might anticipate having the mortgage paid off in 10 years or in 15 years or in 5 years, depending on your financial situation. All of that is going to be relevant to your planning. Now, the U and the G in the MUG expenses are utilities and groceries. So those are going to be anticipated and current costs for things like electricity, for water, for trash removal, and so on. But in this internet age, we might also factor in things like your cable bill, your internet bill, telephone service, do you have Netflix subscriptions, and so on. Any other loans also you're going to want to factor in here: car loans, vehicle loans of other kinds, any boat loans that you might have available, farm equipment for some people. Do you have revolving credit card debt? Do you keep balances on cards? What is the balance? What is the interest rate? When is it likely to be paid off? Also, you want to factor in student loans. They could be yours, possibly unlikely if you're in retirement age, but you might have co-signed on an unforgivable loan for a son, a daughter, for a grandchild. Then, and if you have, then that's also going to need to be factored in. Now, the final consideration in costs that I'll mention here is going to be the actual projections that you have for your long-term care costs. Now, that is complicated, nuanced enough that I'm going to try and tackle it in at least one other video, possibly two, depending on what conception I end up going with. But those are going to be for another conversation. In this conversation, I know we've gone through a lot of stuff. So we've talked about assets that you might have, money you've got in bank accounts and retirement accounts. We've talked about possible income streams from Social Security, pension, from private sources like annuities, or from rental properties. We've talked about property. We've talked about debts that you might have. We've talked about legal instruments. If you found something of use in this video, I would ask that you click the like button, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it's released, and look forward to some of those future conversations where I'll get more into, number one, what you're actually going to be looking for in these discussions about planning. Now that you've gathered your information, we're going to get into some of the number crunching and actually what you would be looking for to make a rough guess of how much money you might need. We'll talk about projections for cost of care. I might also get into some of the probabilities that a given person is going to get Alzheimer's disease or actually need care. But those will be for future discussions. I thank you so much for being with me today. I wish you well in your planning, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thank you so much.